The silver USB drive clattered onto the police station counter at 11:47 p.m., and the officer's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. Behind Elena, footsteps echoed through the lobby. Not the pursuit she'd outrun through the dark woods, but something worse. Her father-in-law had arrived to collect her, and in his perfectly pressed suit and practiced smile, he looked like a concerned parent. By midnight, everything would change. But that morning had begun like any other. Elena sat on the gray linen sofa with her book, a thick paperback with cracked spine pages that had carried her through Tuesday evenings for the past 3 weeks. The title read, "The Silent Patient," and she'd just reached the twist, the part where everything you thought you knew fell apart. Outside, rain hammered against the window glass. Next to her, Mark scrolled through his tablet with the lazy contentment of someone who'd made it through another workday without catastrophe. The living room was wrapped in warm, yellow lamplight, shadows stretching long across the furniture. This was their place. This was safe. Then came the pounding on the door. Not a doorbell. Not a knock. A fist striking wood with pure aggression. Mark jumped so violently that his tablet slid onto the rug, screen still glowing. The pounding came again, 4 loud rhythmic thuds that made Elena's throat tighten. Bam, 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 bam. Mark's shoulders hunched as he stood. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" he said, moving toward the hallway. He opened the door. Arthur and Martha pushed past him before he could speak, not waiting for invitation or greeting. Arthur wore a wool coat sodden with rain, droplets running down his face. Martha clutched her LV monogram bag like a shield, her designer purse the only thing that looked dry about her. Water dripped from Arthur's coat onto their hardwood floor, small puddles forming on the entryway tiles. "We need to talk, now," Arthur said, his voice forced into something resembling authority even as his face turned red. "Internal Revenue is freezing the accounts." Martha sank onto the edge of the sofa without removing her coat. She reached into her handbag with shaking fingers and pulled out a crumpled pink tissue, beginning to dab at her eyes, though Elena saw no tears. "They're going to take the house, Marky," Martha whined, her voice pitched to maximum distress. "Your childhood home?" Elena stood, wrapping her arms across her chest. She watched Arthur's eyes dart toward the hallway, toward their home office. His gaze lingered there too long, cataloging, assessing. The book she'd been reading slipped from her lap. "How much do you need exactly?" Elena asked, her tone careful. Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he pulled Mark into the narrow hallway, and Elena heard the rustle of paper before she could follow. She walked to the hallway entrance and stopped, seeing her husband backed against the wall near the thermostat. The reading showed 72 degrees. On any other day, it would seem perfectly comfortable. Arthur held a folded legal document, the paper trembling with his agitation. He'd already unfolded it, the motion sharp and violent. "Quit claim deed" was printed in bold across the top. "Just sign this as a witness and co-guarantor," Arthur demanded, his voice carrying the tone he'd used when Mark was 16 and had wrecked the family car. "It's a formality." Mark looked down at the paper. His hand stayed behind his back. He shook his head slowly, and Elena watched her father-in-law's face darken to a shade she'd never seen before, a purple that looked dangerous. "I can't sign a financial guarantee without a lawyer looking at it, Dad," Mark said, his voice trembling. Arthur lunged. The movement was so sudden that Elena barely registered it as happening. One moment he was holding the paper. The next, his meaty hand had grabbed Mark's upper arm. He squeezed, Mark's face contorted in pain, mouth opening in a silent gasp. Arthur slammed Mark's shoulder back against the wall, and the family photo frames rattled in their places, glass trembling. "After all I did for you?" Arthur snarled, teeth bared like an animal. "You're going to let us rot?" Elena charged forward without thinking. She grabbed Arthur's wrist, found the pressure point her self-defense instructor had taught her years ago, and twisted outward with all her weight. His hand opened reflexively, and Mark stumbled forward as Elena used her momentum to drive them both away from the wall. Arthur lost his balance and crashed backward into the console table. The decorative ceramic bowl fell first, the sound of impact making everything stop for one frozen moment. Then it shattered, blue pieces scattering across dark wood, fragments skittering in a dozen directions. "Get your hands off him!" Elena screamed, her voice shrill and foreign in her own ears. "Out! Get out of my house!" Arthur righted himself, breathing heavily. He glared at Elena with such pure hatred that she took an involuntary step backward. His thick finger pointed at her chest, trembling with rage. "You're an outsider," he hissed, the words coming through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what loyalty means." He turned and walked toward the living room where Martha had appeared in the hallway, her eyes wide. Neither of them looked at Mark as Arthur wrenched the front door open and stepped into the rain. Martha followed, her heels clicking rapid fire on the hardwood. The door slammed behind them with enough force to rattle the hinges. In the sudden silence, Elena heard only their breathing and the rain outside. Mark's arm bore a red mark where Arthur's fingers had dug in, the outline of a hand already beginning to darken. Elena stared at it, then at the scattered pieces of the ceramic bowl, then at her husband's face. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," Mark said quietly. "Elena, we need to call the police." But Elena was already walking into the living room. On the sofa lay Martha's LV handbag, abandoned in the chaos of their retreat. She looked at it, then at Mark. "Don't," Mark said. "Just call them. They'll come back for it." Elena reached for the bag anyway. Mark put his hand on her shoulder, tried to stop her, but she shrugged him off. The zipper came open with a sharp zip sound, the gold hardware catching the yellow lamplight. She reached inside and pulled out a small black moleskin notebook. Her hands shook as she opened it. The pages were filled with columns of names, dates, and amounts, all written in Arthur's rigid handwriting, each letter precisely formed, each number carefully aligned. She turned pages rapidly, the rustling sound loud in the quiet room. The columns were titled Cash Out and Offshore Transfer. There were dates going back years. There were amounts that made no sense. She stopped on a page with today's date. Their personal address was listed, Mark's social security number, and next to it, a figure, $450,000. The number was circled in red ink. "They aren't losing the house, Mark," Elena whispered. "They're using our names to hide money. They've already started." Mark took the book from her numb fingers. He looked at his own name on the page, at the money amounts, and slowly sank into the armchair. The notebook slid from his grasp and fell onto the floor. "It's not a debt," he said, his voice hollow and broken. "It's a crime." That night, Elena didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with coffee that went cold, watching the rain, waiting for something worse to come. Mark lay upstairs in the dark, his breathing shallow. The red mark on his arm had deepened to purple. Neither of them called the police. Neither of them did anything at all. At 2 a.m., Elena went downstairs to drink water. She stood at the kitchen sink, glass held to her lips, when she heard it. A metallic clink at the back door. The sound of a key or pick in the lock working against the mechanism. She froze. The door burst open. Arthur entered, wearing a dark hoodie that made him look nothing like a father and everything like a burglar. He didn't say anything. He just lunged for the counter where the black notebook sat. Elena grabbed the heavy glass water pitcher and swung. It hit Arthur's shoulder and shattered, water spraying everywhere, glass shards falling like rain. He grunted and shoved her back against the refrigerator. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but feel the cold metal against her spine. Mark came running from upstairs. He tackled his father from the side, driving him away from Elena. Both men crashed into the wooden kitchen table, and it tilted precariously, almost going over before settling again. Chairs dragged across the tile floor with a horrible scraping sound. "Get out!" Mark shouted, his voice raw. "I'm calling the police!" Arthur kicked Mark away, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed the notebook from the floor. For one terrible moment, he looked at his son with an expression so filled with hatred that Elena thought he might attack him again. But then he bolted for the door, his footsteps pounding on the porch, fading into the dark. A line of blood ran down his cheek from where glass had cut him. The rain had stopped by morning. Elena sat at the computer in their home office while Mark slept the sleep of the completely exhausted. She tried to log into their joint savings account. A bright red banner appeared across the screen. "Account restricted. Contact authorities." The message included a case reference number, IRS 882B. She opened a PDF attachment from an automated bank email. It was a lien notice. She read it once, then again. The primary name on the debt wasn't Arthur's. It was Mark's name, listed as Chief Financial Officer of A&M Holdings. Their home address was printed below. His social security number was printed below that. Elena's hands began to shake as she scrolled to the amount. The same amount from the notebook, $450,000. "He didn't just hide money, Mark," she whispered to the empty room. "He stole Mark's life." She checked the incorporation date on the document. October 14th, 3 years ago. The same month Arthur had gifted them the down payment for their house. The money that had seemed like generosity at the time. That had made her think finally, Mark's father had accepted her as family. Mark walked in holding a fresh cup of coffee. He stopped when he saw the monitor. Elena turned it toward him. His hand tilted slowly, and hot coffee spilled over his thumb, running down his wrist. He didn't move. He didn't react to the heat. "He told me those were just health insurance papers I was signing 3 years ago," Mark said, his voice barely audible. That afternoon, Mark's phone vibrated on the coffee table. The caller ID said, "Dad." Mark stared at it for a long moment, then put it on speaker. Arthur's voice came through, crisp and businesslike, with the background sounds of a train station or airport. "Listen carefully," Arthur said. "There is an encrypted USB in your basement, hidden in the fuse box. I need the code sent to me by tomorrow morning." Mark looked at Elena. He was sweating now, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "What's on it, Dad?" Mark asked, his voice breaking. "Why us?" Static crackled through the line. When Arthur spoke again, his tone had dropped an octave, becoming something cold and precise and entirely devoid of paternal affection. "If I don't get that code, the shell company defaults. You'll lose the house, your credit, and probably go to prison for the tax fraud I put in your name. 24 hours. The line went dead. The dial tone was a flat, mocking beep. Elena stood and looked toward the basement door. "We're not giving him the code," she said, her voice hard. "We're giving him to the feds." The basement was dark and cold. Elena descended the wooden stairs carefully, a flashlight illuminating the concrete floor below. She found the fuse box on the far wall. Behind the metal plate, when she unbolted it, there was a small space. In that space sat a silver USB drive, the size of her thumb, its blue light blinking steadily. She held it up to the beam of her flashlight. Such a small thing. So much destruction contained in such a small thing. They scrambled into their white sedan. Mark reversed out of the driveway, tires spitting gravel, gravel flying in arcs behind them. The rearview mirror showed their house receding, the door still standing open where they'd left it. The street stretched ahead, empty and quiet. Mark accelerated, turning onto the main road that led toward the police station. Elena held the USB drive in her lap, her fingers wrapped around it. Then, at the end of the suburban street, a black Escalade appeared. It didn't slow down. It didn't tap the brakes. It accelerated directly toward them, the engine roaring with the force of a V8, screaming at full throttle. Elena realized it was Martha behind the wheel. Martha's face was visible through the tinted windshield, her expression stone cold and absolutely certain. "Mark, look out!" Elena screamed. "She's not stopping." He tried to swerve, but there wasn't time. There was never enough time. The Escalade slammed into the side of their sedan, with a sound like the world cracking open. The impact spun them. Metal crumpled with a bone-jarring screech that Elena would hear in her nightmares for years to come. The sedan slid off the road and into a shallow, muddy ditch. Curtain airbags deployed, white clouds filling the interior. Elena's head whipped sideways, her vision blurring, the world tilting at an impossible angle. When everything stopped moving, there was only the hiss of steam rising from the hood and the sound of their breathing. Martha stepped out of the Escalade, dressed in a pristine beige trench coat that looked like it had never been touched by dirt or struggle or anything real. She stood at the edge of the ditch, looking down at them. The steam rose around her, like she was standing at the entrance to something mythological. "Give me the drive, Elena," Martha said, her voice perfectly calm. "Don't make this any worse for my son." Elena didn't give her the drive. Instead, she grabbed Mark's hand and pulled him from the wrecked sedan. They crawled out the passenger door, already damaged and hanging at an angle. The mud was thick, sucking at their feet. They ran. Through the rain that was starting again, through trees and branches that whipped at their faces, leaving scratches and blood. Behind them, they heard Martha shouting, heard the Escalade's engine roaring as she tried to angle it into the ditch after them. They didn't stop running until they couldn't see the road anymore. The motel room had water stains on the ceiling and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke from 1,000 previous guests. Elena cleaned the cut on Mark's forehead with a damp washcloth, using water from a coffee mug on the bedside table. The neon vacancy sign outside buzzed constantly, a rhythmic electrical hum that seemed to mock their presence there. "We need to call someone," Mark said, sitting on the edge of the moth-eaten bedspread. Elena was already on his phone. She called their family lawyer, Mr. Henderson. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. "Henderson, thank God," Mark said, relief flooding his voice. "My parents just attacked us. We have the drive with the evidence." The person on the other end spoke, but it wasn't Henderson's voice. It was Arthur. "Henderson has been my golfer and my payroll clerk for 20 years, Marky," Arthur said, his tone carrying the amusement of someone who'd been 12 steps ahead all along. "Did you really think he'd help you?" Elena realized, in that moment, what the GPS on the phone meant. What being traceable meant. She grabbed the device from Mark's hands and hurled it against the wall. It shattered with a crack that sounded final and complete. The screen went dark. "They know where we are," Elena said, panic rising in her throat like bile. "We have to go. Now." They ran out the back fire exit. The motel's hallway lights spilled onto the wet pavement outside, illuminating the dumpster where two men were waiting. One held a tire iron, and the other had the build of someone who'd spent years breaking things that didn't want to be broken. Elena and Mark froze. The man with the tire iron swung it in a smooth, practiced arc. Mark ducked and tackled the man's knees. They both hit the asphalt hard, the air leaving Mark's lungs in a harsh grunt. The second man grabbed Elena by her hair, yanking her head back, and she felt her scalp scream with pain. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her keychain, heavy, weighted down with too many keys accumulated over years. She swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The keys raked across the man's face, tearing flesh, drawing blood that looked black in the dim light. He screamed and let go, his hand flying to his face. But Mark was in trouble. The first man had gotten the upper hand, was driving his knee down into Mark's ribs. Mark groaned and curled into a ball, his body folding in on itself. The man with the tire iron was raising it for a final blow, the weapon coming up slow and deliberate. "Run, Elena," Mark gasped, his voice breaking. "Take the drive." Elena hesitated for one fraction of a second. In that fraction, she saw everything she would lose if she didn't move. She turned and sprinted into the dark tree line behind the motel. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit. Behind her, the roar of a car engine starting. She ran through the darkness, branches whipping at her face, her hands gripped around the USB drive. She ran until her lungs burned, and her legs screamed, and her mind went white with fear. She ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the forest growing darker and deeper around her. Eventually, she found the road. Cars passed. She stood on the shoulder in the rain, her clothes muddy and torn, waving until someone stopped. A woman in a minivan took her to the hospital. Elena asked for directions to the nearest police station instead. She burst through the glass doors of the 24-hour police substation at 11:47 p.m. The fluorescent lights were bright and harsh, reflecting off white floors with an almost surgical intensity. She looked like a ghost, or a madwoman, or both. Her clothes were torn and mud-stained. Blood was drying on her hands. The desk officer stood up, his hand moving to his holster. Elena ignored the potential threat entirely. She slammed the silver USB drive onto the high laminate counter with a sharp clack that echoed through the small lobby. "I'm Elena Van Camp," she said, her voice sharp and clear despite the shaking. "My father-in-law is Arthur Van Camp. This drive contains 10 years of money laundering, and he's holding my husband captive." She pulled out her laptop before anyone could respond. Her hands were shaking as she connected to the station's public Wi-Fi. Her fingers flew across the keys as she prepared a blind copy email to 3 major news outlets. She uploaded the contents of the drive. All the spreadsheets, all the names, all the offshore transfers and dummy corporations and years of systematic financial crimes. She hit enter. The progress bar filled up. 25%, 50%, 75%, 100%. The message appeared. Message sent. Elena let out a single, jagged breath. She was sitting in a plastic chair in the lobby when Arthur and Martha arrived. They swept in, looking polished and concerned. A perfect portrait of worried parents. Arthur had a small bandage on his cheek. Martha wore clean clothes and her designer bag. They looked like people who belonged in a police station, like people with authority and credibility and the kind of background that police officers respected. "Officer, thank God," Arthur said, his voice taking on the soothing, reasonable tone he probably used in business meetings. "Our daughter-in-law has been missing. She's had a severe mental break. Please, we need to take her home." Elena didn't move. She pointed to the television mounted in the corner of the lobby, the one that had been showing the 24-hour news network when she arrived. Breaking news. The banner read across the screen. The news anchor was speaking, her voice clear and professional. Massive data leak reveals multi-million-dollar offshore surcharge scheme. Van Camp Holdings at center of investigation. Arthur's face drained of color. Martha's hand found his arm. The corporate logo for Van Camp Holdings appeared on the screen behind the anchor. The logo that Arthur had designed 20 years ago, the one he'd been so proud of. 2 additional officers emerged from the back office, handcuffs at their belts. They moved toward Arthur and Martha with the casual competence of people who'd done this many times before. The officers stepped into the in-laws' personal space. Elena stood up, tall and straight. She looked at her father-in-law directly in the eye. "It's over, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything she'd survived to get here. "Loyalty doesn't mean covering for a leech." The officers took Arthur and Martha away. Elena sat back down in the plastic chair and waited for morning. Mark lay in the hospital bed with his arm in a cast and a bandage covering his eye. His ribs were wrapped, the tape visible beneath a thin hospital gown. The heart monitor beeped steadily. A rhythm that meant he was alive, meant he would recover, meant the violence hadn't ended him the way the violence sometimes does. Elena sat beside him, holding his hand. The morning sun was shining through the window, dust motes floating in the bright beam like tiny planets in their own small orbit. "I didn't sign those papers because I was scared, Elena," Mark said, his voice soft and careful. "I didn't sign them because I'd already spent months gathering the proof against them." He reached into the bedside table with his free hand and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. His hand was shaking slightly as he held it out to her. The password was written in his handwriting. EliSafe 2022. Elena stared at it. She stared at the date, 2022, and realized he'd hidden the drive for a year. A year of living with his parents' pressure, with their financial threats, with the fear of being discovered. A year of planning.